The Prime Minister warns he will impose the tightest coronavirus restrictions on Greater Manchester to save lives if agreement can't be reached with local leaders. As Lancashire becomes the latest region to enter Tier 3 restrictions, Boris Johnson urges Greater Manchester's leaders to follow suit.
I urge the Mayor to reconsider and engage constructively. I cannot stress enough, time is of the essence.
As millions more people across the UK face tighter restrictions this weekend, Boris Johnson says he will resist another national lockdown if at all possible. A travel ban has just come into force on the Welsh border. No one from the UK's coronavirus hotspot areas is allowed in. Are we heading for a no-deal Brexit? Downing Street says talks between the UK and EU are over and there's no point in continuing unless the EU softens its stance. And what a year for the British jockey Holly Doyle. 117 wins so far, the highest number of winners ridden in a year by a woman.
And coming up on BBC News, we look ahead to what could be the best Merseyside derby for years as top of the table Everton take on Liverpool.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. The Prime Minister has told the Mayor of Greater Manchester that he is prepared to intervene and impose the highest level of coronavirus restrictions, Tier 3, on the region if no agreement can be reached between local leaders and the government. The Mayor, Andy Burnham, is seeking a bigger package of financial support for businesses that would be forced to close as a result. Lancashire has now agreed to impose Tier 3 restrictions and join the Liverpool City region, seen here in red, on very high alert, the tightest restrictions. The same measures will come into force in Lancashire tomorrow, meaning no mixing between households, indoors or outdoors in certain settings like private gardens. Pubs and bars will close unless they serve a substantial meal, and people should avoid non-essential travel into or out of the area. But Lancashire has won some concessions. Unlike Liverpool, gyms and leisure centres won't have to close, but soft play centres and car boot sales will from Monday. Boris Johnson has again rejected the idea of a national circuit breaker to try to reduce rates of the virus, saying it would unfairly punish places where infections are low. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young.
It's taken days of negotiations. Finally, local leaders in Lancashire and ministers in London have come up with a deal. More restrictions are coming across the county, alongside millions of pounds in financial support. But some shoppers here in Nelson want a different approach.
I think they should have done it earlier, to be quite honest. But my mum's 87, you can't tell my mother to stop in, because she won't.
I think it's good. I think it needs to be made tougher. I think the way the government's been coming across, they haven't been clear on the rules anyway.
There's no transparency, total, utter confusion.
Boris Johnson's opted for a regional approach because many places have fewer COVID cases than hotspots in the north of England. But it's meant more talking, more wrangling over money and more delay.
No one wants to have to implement these measures which damage local businesses, but these decisions were necessary because of the rate of increase not just of infections, but also in hospitalisations and admissions to intensive care.
But not every area has signed up. The Labour Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, and some Conservative MPs are fighting plans for more closures unless there's extra money for businesses affected. Don't you now have to make a quick decision about whether you impose those extra restrictions on places, including Greater Manchester, or give them more money to persuade them? Which will it be and when?
It's far better to do it together because we want the maximum local buy-in, the maximum local enforcement and the maximum local compliance. And that means local leadership. I hope that Greater Manchester will come on board. The national government must reserve the right to step in and do what is necessary.
For many cities, including Nottingham, the uncertainty continues. Cases and hospitalisations are rising quickly and additional measures could be on the way. One former Prime Minister says the government has to be more generous.
At the very time that we're increasing the requirements on people not to do things and denying people the chance of jobs, we're reducing the economic support. Now, if I was Boris Johnson, again, you've got to be one step ahead. What he should be doing is calling the Chancellor this morning, telling him that his economic recovery package is not going to work, get him to bring a new economic recovery package, and I think you could build consent around that.
Boris Johnson says the situation's worsening with every passing day. There's real tension between Westminster and some local leaders, but decisions need to be taken very soon. Vicky Young, BBC News, Westminster.
So Lancashire moves into the highest level of restrictions this weekend. Our correspondent Judith Moritz has been talking to residents and businesses in Lancaster.
Lancashire woke up to uncertainty and rumour. Mid-morning, confirmation came. The county's soaring infection rates causing it to move up from the middle to the highest COVID alert level. It means that today you could have a lunchtime drink in this Lancaster bar. Tomorrow you won't be able to. Along with other non-food pubs, when the doors close tonight, it's not certain when they'll reopen.
Is it 2 weeks? Is it 3 weeks? Is it 3 months? The information is passed so poorly. We've just not understood where we stand, really. And of course, our staff are asking us questions. We can't answer them.
For Lauren behind the bar, it means real worry about finances and the future.
On the 80%, I was in the red already. Do you know what I mean? I was like having to pay out more just for bills and things like that than what I was bringing in. So it's going to make that even worse, like with it going down to the 2/3.
There were late-night negotiations between regional and national government. Some local leaders said they'd won a good deal. Others say their hands have been forced.
Unless you agree to go to Tier 3 and thereby accept the deal, if you don't, you won't receive any monies and you won't receive that support. That felt like being bullied, blackmailed to me.
10 reps, so 5 on each side.
Though gyms in Liverpool have closed, in Lancashire, under the same alert level, they've been allowed to stay open.
Well, I think it's brilliant, to be honest with you. I think gyms need to stay open, really, and providing that we're sticking to the rules and the sanitising and the one-way systems, I don't see why they shouldn't be open.
I think it's a bit strange, really. If it's safe in one area, surely it must be safe in the other area.
This has been a bit of a lifeline. When we were off for 3 months from gyms, my fitness was just going down, and as a result, you get more stressed, you get more anxious.
So 12 push press, 6 on each
Gym
side.
owner says she's grateful that local leaders pushed for her industry to stay open.
So the stakes are really high. The people that have lobbied for us to, as a whole, for the gyms to stay open, they provided us that lifeline now to keep trying to drive our business forward. If it had gone the other way and gyms had closed, I think we'd have really struggled. Nice work, Sarah, well done.
High energy here.
So reach for those toes.
But elsewhere, others say their blood pressure's rising with all the changes and the feeling that what's allowed in one place may be forbidden a short distance away. Well, with pubs in Lancashire here closing from tonight and other facilities like casinos and betting shops from Monday, there are also gyms like the one here behind me making the most of being able to stay open throughout. But that's the case in Lancashire. Over in Liverpool, local leaders are annoyed, they say, at these differences between areas, particularly when it comes to gyms. They say they would like the government to explain why a gym in Liverpool is a greater risk of COVID transmission than one here in Lancashire. And those leaders in Liverpool say tonight they simply won't accept their region being treated differently to other areas like Lancashire. They say the inconsistencies they're seeing undermine the whole new system, they say, right from the off.
Judith Moritz, thank you. The latest government figures show there were 15,650 new coronavirus infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. The average number of new cases reported per day in the last week is now 16,228. 773 people are being admitted to hospital on average each day over the past week. This number doesn't include Scotland. 136 deaths were reported. That's people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test. It means, on average, in the past week, 107 deaths were announced every day. It takes the total number of deaths so far across the UK to 43,429. Well, the Prime Minister says until a vaccine has been found, mass testing for coronavirus will be the solution to reopening the economy and society. Boris Johnson says several kinds of rapid tests are being looked at, some that can provide results in just 15 minutes. It comes as a new survey shows that the number of infections in England rose by more than 60% last week. Our health editor, Hugh Pym, reports.
Getting test results back can take time. The Prime Minister said new technology would allow faster turnarounds and more frequent testing to pick up those without symptoms. Using random testing, the Office for National Statistics works out how many have got it each week, with and without symptoms.
The latest ONS survey covered community infections in the week to October the 8th, though not including Scotland. It showed in England there were nearly 28,000 new cases each day, up more than 60% on the previous week. That's about 1 in 160 of the population with the virus. In Wales, infections also went up, with about 1 in 390 with the virus. The proportion in Northern Ireland was 1 in 250.
The situation is deteriorating, and we need to brace for it. We also need to be aware that even any actions that we take today is going to need 2 or 3 weeks before having an effect, and it might actually be a good effect only in 4 to 6 weeks.
We're under a lot of pressure every day now.
As more people pick up the virus, a certain proportion will need hospital treatment. And this video put out today by Liverpool City Council aims to warn the local population of the consequences. But doctors say outcomes are better. Health Service Journal estimates that the death rate for hospital COVID patients fell by 50% between April and September. An intensive care specialist told me what had changed with the care of very sick patients.
We became better at recognising the disease early and therefore implementing treatment early. And it's always better to prevent deterioration rather than to treat things after the event. And of course, we saw development in terms of potential drugs that may have a benefit for patients.
More patients are pulling through, but it takes time for them to recover. Some have ongoing symptoms after leaving hospital. And as more beds are occupied, there's a chance others will miss out on less urgent treatment and operations. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
Well, let's talk to our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young in Westminster. So we've now got a situation with Tier 3. We've got gyms that are open in Lancashire, not in Liverpool. Liverpool's mayor says it's madness. The tensions between local government, local leaders and the government are really being laid bare.
Yeah, they are. And if you think back to the national lockdown in the spring, of course, nobody wanted it, but it did have the advantage of simplicity. What the government's doing now, though, is going for this regional approach because not every area is suffering in the same way. But that does mean that things have got a little bit fractious. Now, I think there are risks on both sides here for the government. They're being accused of not coming up with the cash to compensate those people, many of them who are losing their livelihoods. On the other side, you've got some local mayors who are being accused of delaying really important decisions that could actually save lives. Meanwhile, you've got businesses sitting and waiting, simply not knowing if they'll even be allowed to open in the coming days or weeks. And I think there's another possible problem here. If you see politicians arguing about the possibility of tighter rules, does that undermine that public health message? And does it mean people become less likely to follow them in the first place?
Vicky, thank you. Downing Street has said that Brexit trade talks are over and there's no point in negotiations continuing unless there's a fundamental shift in the EU's position. Boris Johnson says we should get ready for leaving without a deal on January the 1st after an EU summit in Brussels insisted it's the British who should be making concessions. Here's our Europe editor, Katya Adler.
EU leaders had lots on their mind at this summit, the COVID crisis first and foremost. But eyes and ears here were also very focused today on Downing Street. How would Boris Johnson react to their demand that the UK must give way first if a trade deal is to be agreed? The answer? Not positively.
It's clear from the summit that after 45 years of membership, they are not willing, unless there's some fundamental change of approach, to offer this country the same terms as Canada. And so with high hearts and with complete confidence, we will prepare to embrace the alternative and we will prosper mightily.
Downing Street's clear message: trade talks are over unless the EU changes its tune. No chance, retorted France's Emmanuel Macron.
We're always conscious that it's the United Kingdom that wanted to leave the European Union and that is leaving the European Union, and that needs an agreement even more than we do.
After months and months of EU and UK negotiators shuttling backwards and forwards between London and Brussels, both sides are fed up. The key sticking point still in talks: the rights of EU fishermen to fish in UK waters after Brexit, competition regulations known as the level playing field, and how disputes should be resolved if a trade deal is agreed. Angela Merkel said today the EU's chief negotiator would head to London on Monday to launch intense last-ditch talks. But this evening the government said no. As things stand, there was no point. Both sides have now growled at each other and gnashed their teeth. So, is this the end of the road, or political posturing before difficult compromises are reached? Concessions are needed from both the government and the EU if a deal is to be found. And for those who believe this deal is the right way forward, tonight feels like a case of so near and yet so far. Katya Adler, BBC News, Brussels.
Our political correspondent Jonathan Blake is in Westminster, so that is the question. Are these talks really over?
Well, those words from the Prime Minister's spokesman earlier, that the trade talks are over, sounded like a bit of a bombshell, didn't they? You could be forgiven for hearing that and assuming that this was the end of the process and there would be no free trade agreement between the UK and the EU come that deadline at the end of December. But it is one thing to say that the talks are over, it is another to refuse to negotiate from here on in. And Boris Johnson hasn't done that. He has left the door open slightly to further talks, although he's made it very clear he expects the EU to make the next move. So we're told this afternoon the UK's chief negotiator Lord Frost was on the phone to his opposite number in Brussels, Michel Barnier, saying that there was no basis for planned negotiations in London this coming week, but they did agree to talk on the phone early next week. So lines of communication are open, and while this is a standoff, there are many weeks to go in this process, and throughout, deadlines have come and gone, and negotiations have nearly always gone to the wire.
Jonathan, thank you. People from areas of the UK with high levels of coronavirus, including level 2 in England, are now banned from entering Wales. Some parts of Wales were already closed to visitors, but from tonight, no one from hotspot areas outside Wales is allowed to cross the border. Well, Hal Griffith is on the Welsh border for us now. Hal.
Yes, Sophie, the ban came in at 6 p.m, so now anyone crossing this bridge into Wales faces the possibility of being stopped and questioned by the police and turned around if they've travelled from a COVID hotspot. Unprecedented, but this evening, even that measure looks to be overtaken by even tougher restrictions next week. It looks almost inevitable that Wales will have its own national limited lockdown, a circuit breaker if you like. It's a measure resisted on that side of the border, but Wales looks set to follow its own path.
A divide defined by roads and rivers. The Welsh border meanders north to south for 160 miles. Now it's a new front in the fight against the virus. Anyone living outside of Wales in a COVID hotspot is barred unless they're travelling for work, education or to provide care.
I haven't even been on the bus. I'm too frightened to go on the bus.
For sisters Julie, Sue and Janet, it's welcome. They are wary of visitors to Monmouth, a town which last week recorded 0 cases of COVID.
Because they're not doing the rules in where they are coming from, and you look on the telly and they're all mingling, and well, we don't want it, do we?
Well, we've been trying to protect ourselves right the way through lockdown as much as we can, and we've, like you say, we've been lucky here.
The Police Federation says the new rules are unenforceable.
Thanks now, bye.
But extra patrols have been promised with this warning.
If you do travel to Wales, we will engage with you. We will encourage you to return to your home area, and anybody who is deliberately flouting the law will be issued with fixed penalty tickets.
The border ban is largely to protect rural communities. Most of Wales is already closed to visitors because of local lockdowns. And next week, the whole nation could be told to stay at home
as part of even tougher restrictions. A decision on a so-called fire break will be announced on Monday.
The situation is so serious that we have no option but to look at new and different ways to keep Wales and to keep you safe. Doing nothing is not an option.
But doing what exactly and for how long? Further down the border in Chepstow, Mandy says she's willing to close if it means saving Christmas trade.
It's not going to go away, but we need to control it. I'm hoping that the 2-week, 3-week is going to see all the numbers go down. Everyone's going to settle down, and we just have to learn to live with it.
There's no doubt the tide has turned. We are heading towards harder times, which may test everyone's limits. Howard Griffith, BBC News, Caldicot.
New stricter coronavirus measures have also come into effect in Northern Ireland this evening. Restaurants, pubs and hotels are having to significantly reduce services, and hair and beauty salons have had to shut. Business leaders have warned that a financial support scheme set up by the devolved government is inadequate. And from midnight, London is going into Tier 2, the high alert level of restrictions. 9 million people will no longer be able to meet other households in their homes or other indoor spaces. Our special correspondent Lucy Manning reports on what it will mean for the capital.
The UK's largest city, its busiest city, is now going to get a lot quieter. Tonight, the last chance for some to meet together in homes, pubs, restaurants.
Whilst bookings are reasonable for tonight and people are using this almost as a last hurrah of going out, we've got thousands of cancellations over the next few weeks in our business in central London.
It's not just the economic cost, but the personal one. At the school gate in North London, they want the restrictions to work, but don't really understand them.
It's very silly. It's very silly that they go to school, they see everybody, but at home they can't meet family and friends.
They literally change things like every 2 seconds. Like you blink your eye, oh, another rule has come. Oh, another law has come. So it's like, how do you know these things? And
do you understand what's happening tonight and what's changing?
No.
I'm Captain Fantastic!
And the restrictions on indoor mixing will mean many cancelled parties. The children's entertainment industry wants to be able to work indoors.
So for children, this is a life event. So if weddings and other such things can go ahead, you know, this is so important to children, not just for families and friends, but them, it's a life event and it's great for their well-being.
This week, the Met Police broke up a wedding reception in West London with more than 100 guests. The force says with London moving to the high alert level, there will be extra patrols near pubs and bars.
The new restrictions are absolutely necessary.
Do you think these new restrictions are going to be hard to enforce in pubs and restaurants?
I think it's going to be extremely difficult. And the easier way is to have a complete circuit break. It allows a much easier way of controlling it, and it will guarantee we stop this contagion in its tracks.
It's still a bit of a mixed picture in London. More than a third of boroughs have more than 100 cases per 100,000 people, and other areas are approaching that. But London as a whole is below the national average, although there are more people here going into hospital now.
London, York, Essex, Barrow and other areas join those who've had to live under these rules for weeks, sometimes months. The hope that the disruption will pay off, that cases will fall. But once the rules tighten tonight, they might be here for some time. Lucy Manning, BBC News.
The national lockdown in March saw a rise in the number of vulnerable children being groomed to carry drugs across the UK for dealers, so-called county lines gangs. Now, with restrictions tightening all over the UK again, the Children's Society is concerned that even more children will be exploited. 3 young men who were lured in have been speaking to the BBC's Amanda Curtin about how they became caught up in the culture of the roads, as they call it.
What does the roads do? The roads, they kill you. You know, they make sure that you go to jail for life. The roads make sure that your future gets cut short. The road steals your dreams and ambitions.
When I became a teenager, that's when it started feeling a bit different. That's when I started getting eyes. That's when, you know, the stop and searches started happening and things like that. And it was just such a drastic change in such a quick amount of time that I just wasn't ready for. I couldn't prepare myself. No one could.
When I was around 14, there was an older. I heard that he was selling, so I thought maybe he could give me a chance. Trust me, I could trust him. He could help me make some money.
When you come out your house, you know, you see your friends' older brothers, you see, you know, their cousins or whatever, and, you know, because everyone knows everyone, they're saying hello to your mum when they're coming in and out of the shops and things like that, and it's quite family knit. But what you know, but you don't really realise is that some of these are drug dealers at the end of the day.
They were asked to meet you, not just to buy or sell something, just to link and chill, innit? Bun a zoo. And when you're both bunning, you're both mash up, and then you tend to open up a lot more. You'll become close friends, and that's how it all happens.
You don't know when mum's gonna, you know, find a job. In your head, you're thinking, okay, I've just got to get up and just do it myself, sort of thing. This man's offering me a job.
Over the years, we had less and less money, and I was getting a bit desperate. I would still be hungry throughout the day, and I thought I could pay for my own food, and then I wouldn't be so hungry.
I do believe a lot of young people are trapped, and if you go and ask them, is this where you want to be? They'll say no, but they feel like they've got no other option.
People like outside would call us like a gang or whatever, but we're just a group of lads that went to the same school, we're from the same area. I've been in prison 3 times. When I went to prison the first time, I was 15 years old. The first time was really hard, but you know what, because I got so immune to it for being so long inside, I kind of came out, and not that I missed it, but it was like, you know, it weren't the same again.
Some of the kids that come to Box Up Crime, they see that we look just like them. They see that we talk just like them. They see that we've got experiences just like them. And they see familiar faces that have all made mistakes but have turned it around. They start to realise that there's hope.
I started speaking to my family. Feels better when you tell more people about certain stuff. I felt a lot better about that.
I believe all young boys, especially living in areas such as where I've come from, definitely need the mentors, whether they're exhibiting, you know, bad sort of choices or not.
There was a point where I knew it was like gonna take my mum over the edge. I looked her in the face one day and I said, "You've been crying, innit?" I was given an opportunity by one of the older lot. We all need the opportunity, we all do.
And you can watch the full-length version of the documentary Lost Boys tonight on the BBC News channel at 9:30, and it will also be available on the iPlayer. Now, at a time when most are finding it hard to compete in any sport, one woman has racked up 118 victories so far this year. The jockey, Holly Doyle, has even broken her own British record for winners ridden in a year by a woman. Laura Scott reports.
Pint-sized but with lofty ambitions, Holly Doyle has risen up through the ranks of the weighing room and now only really has her own records to beat.
Now, I've been pretty blessed this year. I was just dreaming of riding a group winner at least this year, and I've ridden a handful, so it's been better than I had ever expected.
Scarlet Dragon puts his nose in front.
She recently became the first female jockey to ride 5 winners in the same day, but says her first Royal Ascot victory was the standout moment of 2020. Doyle's lifestyle is full on. After 8 rides at Newcastle tonight, she's likely to have just 3 hours sleep before racing tomorrow.
It does build up on you. The industry as a whole is very gruelling and demanding, and I think everyone obviously struggles sometimes, but you've just got to try and be as resilient as you can.
State occasion by a length and a half.
This week, Doyle broke her own record for the most wins in a calendar year by a female jockey, notching up number 117 at Kempton. She's 4th in this year's Jockeys' Championship, up from 13th last year, but has her sights on top spot in the future.
You never know, maybe one day it would be a dream come true, but I'm under no perception of how hard it is to become champion jockey.
All right, cheers. Bye-bye. This landmark season isn't over. Tomorrow she's targeting her first top-level win at Champions Day. Though she be but little, she is fierce. Laura Scott, BBC News.
Time now for a look at the weather with Nick Miller.
Hi Sophie, plenty of cloud over the weekend. You may see a little light rain at times, not very much in the rain gauge. Unlike earlier in the month, this map from the Met Office reminds us just how wet it was on the 3rd of October, and a significant day after adding up all the rainfall. The Met Office says that day was the UK's wettest on record, records going back to 1891. Enough rain fell on that day to more than fill Loch Ness. Now, there's a lot of cloud around overnight tonight, and again, there will be a bit of patchy rain and drizzle out there, but it really isn't going to amount to very much, and there'll still be a few clear spells the further west you are, also towards southwest England, and if you are clear for any period of time, it'll be a little cooler than this, but most of us are well above freezing as we start tomorrow and start the weekend. But on a rather grey, gloomy and damp note, again, a few light showers or patchy rain and drizzle, and for Scotland and northern England, some of that continues into the afternoon. You may see a few showers running from the Channel Islands towards Cornwall and Devon, but also a few brighter spells here. But on the whole, sunshine is very hard to come by, and it's on the cool side too. These temperatures a bit below average for the time of year. Little change into Saturday evening. Some of this patchy rain and drizzle in Scotland and northern England will sink a little further south into Sunday, then push back northwards again on Sunday, allowing parts of Wales and southern England to brighten up and turn a bit milder into the afternoon. A cooler feeling day though in Scotland and into northeast England, and may see a bit of patchy rain towards Northern Ireland and western Scotland going into Sunday evening. A sign of a significant weather change into next week. We're losing high pressure, low pressure comes back in, the wind's going to pick up, and of course that means there'll be some more rain coming our way, and this time some more substantial rain at times next week. Umbrella weather on the way back next week, Sophie.
Nick, thank you. And that's all from the BBC News at 6. Now on BBC One, we join the BBC's news teams where you are. Goodbye.